Audio. So welcome everybody. It's really a great pleasure for me to welcome you here, but also we have quite a lot of people connected online. So welcome also to our participants online. I'm Elisa Fornalet. I'm a professor here at the University of Bern, and at the same time I'm also gender coordinator. So it's really a great pleasure to welcome you all for our today gender lecture that is titled Exploring the Prevention of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence in the Anthropocene, a climate justice approach, that will be delivered by our guest, Professor Susan Henry Rimmer. And I would like just to say a few words about our gender lecture series, because today is the last gender lecture for before the summer break, so we will restart again in autumn, but we started really as a kind of experiment in 2019, and with not so high expectation to be still here today. So, but we have been very lucky because we had a super engaged group of women, more than 30, that took part to this gender lecture series, and we had the privilege also to address different kind of topics. So again, I'm very proud that we are still doing, but also what is very important that we have now this cooperation with the Institute of International Relations in Prague, who is really leading the Intersect Observatory. So now the gender lectures are not only based here in Bern, but we have this joint collaboration with the Institute in Prague. And I would like also to thank Dr. Cristani, who is leading that, and all the team in Prague, and all the participants as usual. So our gender lecture today will explore in particular how reforming existing international legal frameworks to adapt to climate risk and prevent conflict-related sexual violence. So Professor Alice Rimmer is really conducting very innovative research in this field. Since years, she is one of the world's leading expert on gender equality and climate justice. And I would like also to say, for me, it's a really great pleasure because we met for the first time 1 year ago. We were on the same panel in Australia, and it was not even imaginable to be here 1 year after together. So I think it's super nice. So Susan Harris Rimmer is professor at the Griffith Law School in Brisbane, where she leads the climate justice team, and she's the founder of the Even Gen Coalition, which seeks to amplify the voices of current and future generation and highlight the long-term impact of today's policy decision. She was in 2021 the winner of the Fulbright Scholarship, and she was hosted at the University of Georgetown. Then she was named as a top innovator by UPLIC World Economic Forum for the Climate Justice Challenge in 2022 for the creation of the Climate Justice Observatory. And she was named one of the 100 global gender experts by Apolitical in 2018 for her work on the G20, and one of the 20 Queensland Voices female leaders in 2019. So I stop here, the list will be much longer, but of her achievement. She published very important and relevant publication. I will invite you all to take a look at her publication, but I would like just to mention one research that she co-edited, the research handbook on feminist engagement with international law, because it's with this book that I started to know your work. So for me, it's really a privilege to have you here. So before giving the floor to our speakers, I would like just to say that we will have also some time for questions at the end of the presentation. We will try to manage online with the Prague, but again, I give you the floor again. It's super huge privilege to have you with us today. So thank you a lot, Susan.
And it is my great privilege to be here, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I apologize in advance for my Australian accent, which is not only Australian, but rural Australian. So I will try to not get excited and speak like a BBC radio presenter so that you can understand me, hopefully. Please come in. And thank you so much for all of you joining online. I'm very grateful for you to be joining me today. So I would like to start, as is the Australian protocol.
Okay, no, sorry.
There we go.
Yeah,
we're perfect. One of the things that Australians do is to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the land on which we work and live. So I would like to respect the elders of the land on which I created this work and thought about this work, which is the Jagera and Turrbal people of Mianchit, Brisbane, Australia. And I want to acknowledge the First Nations wisdom that informs my work, particularly the idea of being a good ancestor and protecting the environment for future generations. So this presentation today is part of a wider climate justice process project. Unfortunately, it is animated by the real fear that I have that climate impacts are going to reverse gender equality gains around the world and particularly in the most climate impacted places first. So I'm interested in how local and global feminist movements can focus on how to preserve human dignity and agency in the choices made by communities to face climate impacts. And I'm interested but sceptical about the value of international law in this quest. So why is it so hard for people to make connections between gender equality and climate change? And I think it is difficult for people. I think, as we can see under the current challenges to gender equality and diversity norms around the world, gender is an misunderstood concept, I think. I recommend this book by Valerie Hudson and co. about thinking about how gender is a really substantial and first order governance principle. So it's not only a question of biology or identity, but it is also a governance principle, and an important one. And if you combine this with the difficulty that we seem to have, and we do have, I find myself, every day I'm thinking about climate justice, and I get overwhelmed constantly in thinking about new ways that systems might impact each other. And so I really like this book by Timothy Morton. I found it very difficult to read, but I really like it. This idea of that climate change is a hyper object, and that for humans, understanding non-human but human created processes is very difficult. I tried to explain it to my teenagers as that the climate now has main character energy, and we are not the main characters in this particular story. We've created a story in which we are being overwhelmed by events. So trying to think about the ecosystem as the subject of the story and not just a backdrop, that's challenge for us. There's a big challenge for human rights lawyers who are used to thinking in profoundly empathetic and human ways, things that always place the vulnerable human, the marginalised human, the human with the least power at the centre of our work. We now have to be more than human rights lawyers. We have to think about the ecosystem as having equal standing and having a joint life, a joint identity with us. So this is why I think this issue is so difficult. I will tell you it's particularly difficult for the United Nations, and I'll explain why. So I talk about starting in 2021 because you have to start somewhere. The UNFCCC has actually struggled with gender as an organising principle right from the beginning, from when we've started to try and govern climate impacts. So I'll talk a bit about that. But we really, at this presentation, I'm really focusing on climate change as an amplifier of conflict-related sexual violence. So we'll start with the Security Council. Whenever climate as a security risk, as a non-traditional risk to human security has been raised, Russia has used its veto power as permanent member, and the most definitively in 2021. Which means the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the protection of children in armed conflict and all the issues that the Security Council think about have just not been able to consider climate change since then, which is at a stark difference from our actual reality as we are experiencing conflict around the world. But African states have done a really good job raising African states have done a really great job of raising in Security Council debates that there is this link between increased sexual violence and the impacts of climate change, forced displacement and economic precarity. Now, there is no single international instrument that deals with gendered harm in disaster, displacement or conflict as exacerbated by climate change. Instead, there's basically a patchwork of norms that we have to put together. But before we get there, so this is what we'll talk about today, that climate risks are becoming more severe and they're happening at a rate that is earlier than even the most pessimistic scientists thought would happen, and they're cascading risks. So they're not entirely predictable. So we know that climate, we kind of have a rough idea of the types of climate harms, but there are certain issues with glaciers go at a particularly faster rate or oceans warm at a particularly faster rate, that there might be all sorts of ramifications that we still don't know. We also know that gendered climate risks are increasing. On every database that we have or evidence base that we have, we know that there is more risk of conflict-related sexual violence exacerbated by climate change. So I'm arguing today that the UN architecture is sort of fragmented in very unhelpful ways, and I'm using Gina Heathcote's idea of ghettos in international law, and I say that gender-based violence in climate change is a triple ghetto, which I'll explain. And as I said, this research is driven by a fear that we will, in fact, reverse some of the precarious gender gains that we have gained over the last 100 years. All right, so just to remind you about what the climate science is saying, what our best climate governance is saying, we finally did get a pathway to 1.5 agreed at COP28, which is shockingly late, even though under Paris we had a net zero transition agreement. We only finally got this particular paragraph, which is the more granular legal obligation at COP28. This idea that we would transition away from fossil fuels by 2050. It was a very hard-won decision, but at least there is a pathway to decarbonisation. Now, what it means that we came so late to this particular more granular agreement about how we were going to hit net zero is that we've been very focused on mitigation in the UNFCCC, and we have not focused as much as we should have on adaptation. So this is where I think a lot of the problems are coming. Just to remind you what it looks like, and the idea that in order for us to avoid the worst issues relating to climate change, we need to see that graph go very rapidly downward, and yet we're not quite there. We're still, despite the world's efforts to shift to renewables and other things, we have not yet got to a stage where the graph is trending downwards. And this is also at a national level. Some countries are trending downwards. Australia is not. We went slightly up in the last 10 days. But as a global nature, we have not yet even tipped that way yet, right? So, and to put this in context, this is what it has to look like if we're going to hit those goals. Okay, so this, I'm very grateful for my colleague, Professor Brendan Mackey, who is a climate scientist, for helping me with some of these visualizations. I find it very helpful. I don't mean to freak you out. I probably have freaked you out. It freaks me out because every degree, every fraction of a degree of climate change matters for human health and human survival, but more importantly, the survival of biodiversity on the planet. So this all, the red line and the green line have vastly different outcomes for the planet. This is not an area where roughly in the middle will be okay. We want to be as much towards the green line as we possibly can. So this are the remaining carbon budgets. This is another way I find that people can usefully understand what we have to do in the next wee while to actually meet our goals under the Paris Agreement. So this is what we have, this is what we consumed, and this is what we're remaining, and it's looking like this 2-degree pathway is still the most likely, but we still have time to try to hit this. But basically, we have a carbon budget which we will meet very soon. So, and then the idea is after that, that's it. Okay, and this is what it looks like based on current targets. So your optimistic scenario unfortunately gets us to 1.8 degrees at the moment. And if countries actually meet the policies and targets they've set, that gets us to 2.7, which is not ideal. So as I said, the more pressure we can put on still, and you can see the urgency here in terms of timelines, the better it is. So this, I highly recommend checking out the Climate Action Tracker because it's updated again since there. So to add to that reasonably interesting picture, let's talk about feminist climate justice as a response. So how do we understand this nexus between gender and climate? And I think this idea of a threat multiplier, so I don't love using defence terminology generally, but I will today. Defence people often talk about force multipliers in terms of their capability. Climate is a threat multiplier, and our best evidence is that it's a 5-fold threat multiplier. So existing conflict drivers will be increased 5-fold according to the latest research, which is that Rhea Malsolin was the former Special Rapporteur for Gender-Based Violence. And I think I like this quote by Antonio Guterres because when he was talking about COVID-19, because I think it also relates to climate change and gender equality. This idea that COVID-19 was an X-ray that showed where the human body was fractured already. And I feel like that is a very useful metaphor for us thinking about what climate justice might be able to help us. The more we understand where the fractures are in the human body, the better we will understand this kind of threat multiplier idea. All right, so essentially, if we're thinking about climate change and armed conflict or human security, I often use this ICRC idea. So basically threats to women and girls multiply or increase in times of instability. And we've known this throughout human history. It's in some of our oldest fairy tales, it's in many of our oldest folk traditions, this idea of scarcity equaling threat to the lives of women and girls. And so if we think about feminist climate justice as necessitating then this idea of a structured systems thinking approach to understanding how we can rectify social inequality that exists now to stop it being amplified in the future. So if we use the Mary Robinson definition of climate justice, it means that there are many levels to climate justice. So there is the level that the people who have least contributed to climate change are the ones facing the worst effects. So that's, for example, people in Pacific Islands who have never contributed to the Industrial Revolution, who do not benefit from the Industrial Revolution, facing the most extreme impacts of climate change, the fastest and the most immediately. There's a level of injustice to that is very palpable in where I am from, in my home. But it's also about the idea of between nations and inside nations. So, for example, if you're a poor person living in the southern states of the US, you will be feeling the impacts of climate change much more than a richer person. So there will be inequities inside states as well. And there are also inequities that are temporal. So the idea that our inability to mitigate climate change for this generation is going to actually be felt much more by future generations. So one way of thinking about this is a child born now is 6 to 7 more times more likely to face a severe weather event than I am, right? As a 52-year-old. So 6 to 7 times more extreme weather events. As an Australian, I can tell you I've faced a few extreme weather events in my time. So that to me is quite terrifying. This is the very lovely way the IPCC report talks about structural vulnerabilities, but they basically, these are scientists writing this. This is the first time they've ever had a social science part of their report. It's also the 6th assessment report is the first time they've ever spoken about gender. So again, the UNFCCC has been going for decades now, but we're only now getting to the adaptation issues and structural vulnerabilities issues. But they seem quite hopeful. Carefully designed and implemented processes that focus on inequities can prevent the worst problems happening from climate change. And that is the truth. So in other words, we have it within ourselves to prevent gender-based violence now, and we will also have it within ourselves to prevent gender-based violence as exacerbated by climate change. So what's holding us back? It's this triple ghetto idea. So Gina Heathcote's always talked about this idea that there's certain ghettos in international law. So there's a beautiful part of Hilary Charlesworth and Christine Chitkin's book, Boundaries of International Law, which is sort of the groundbreaking book, where they say there's something like 900 pages of law about fish and what you're allowed to fish in international waters. And there is half a paragraph on violence against women. And it's not even an explicit paragraph inside the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Nowhere will you see any reference to violence against women. It's written in General Comment 19. So there's this deep silence about violence that affects women on most of the planet, but we've thought of the fish thing and piracy. My Lord, there's reams about piracy. So this is what Gina means about certain ghettos in international law. So both gender and particularly gender-based violence have been positioned at the periphery of various legal regimes, but so has the environment. And in international environmental law is not the same as climate change, but they do need to work together. So harm to the environment has also been at the periphery of international law. And then, as we say, climate change is a relatively new area of international law, which has been very focused on this mitigation target for the last 20 years. So gender and climate adaptation, we say, are definitely the poor relations in the UNFCCC framework. They have a little reference to gender equality in the preamble, but there's no actual substantive obligations to basically adapt to change in a gender responsive manner. But there is something called the Lima Program of Action, which is a gender program of action, but it's really about the representation of women in UNFCCC processes. But even human rights law has pretty much failed us on a deep understanding of how to prevent sexual violence in the context of climate change. So it's at what I would call the acknowledgement phase. You've got all these, I've looked at now at every CEDAW, everything, every country report, every general comment, every press release. And usually when they talk about climate change, they're either talking about states who have climate change policies, adaptation policies, or national adaptation strategies. Or they're talking basically saying women and girls are going to be disproportionately affected by climate change. Often they don't say how. Often they only mean in context of disasters. They haven't really done the deep thinking around all the different ways women and girls will be impacted by climate change. And they definitely haven't done deeper thinking about sexual diversity and LGBTIQ rights and climate change. And there's problems with the human rights law regime and the way it deals with sexual violence anyway, right? Which many feminist scholars have talked about, focus on carceral solutions, really struggled with decolonial approaches, really struggled with more than human rights approaches. And we want to avoid saying women are innately vulnerable to violence, that they're victims. So the other thing you'll often see about climate change is it says women are agents, should be agents of climate adaptation and mitigation. It never says how or how that's going to happen in the current situation, where if you look at the COPs, if you look at the COP family photos for the last 10 years, the most female leaders we've ever had at a COP was 16 out of 178. And in the last COP, of that 16, only 8 leaders made comments about gender, and those were 8 of the female leaders. And they were just a passing reference, this kind of ritualised acknowledgement that women and girls will face differentiated impacts. Not saying, I've never said women and girls will suffer more from climate change. Men and boys will also suffer from climate change. They will suffer in differentiated ways that we need to understand. And we need to understand because there's already current levels of discrimination. So what does that look like? So some of the things that that are going to have a gendered impact with climate change are these types of ideas, that there's very little representation of women in all the climate processes. So barely any of the people who write the IPCC reports are women. They've had a sustained attempt to make that better, but it's still pretty bad. As I said, only 16 leaders last year, only 16% of ministers for environment are women. If property or the ability to be mobile as a adaptation strategy is very important, access to good quality information and access to finance, then women have real problems around all of those things under the current data that we have. And we know things like women right now are 14 times more likely to die from men in natural disasters. And the only time that's different is when a hurricane or cyclone is named after a woman, men are more likely to die, which is a really weird fact, I think, because they don't take that cyclone as seriously, apparently, if it's named after a woman, which I find just bizarre. Now, this is not because of any innate vulnerabilities, it's because of access to information, it's because of caring responsibilities, because they're not in as many public spaces where they find out in time about natural disaster occurring. It's about resources. But the number one reason founded by UNDP was this caring responsibilities. Can't leave the elderly, can't leave the child. So what research we have about the climate impacts of GBV, I really enjoy this particular article. I think it's a good starting point for all of us. And it really looks about goes through the current international law regime and sort of talks about the various weaknesses of that. Really, we don't have great disaster norms in international law. So we still don't have a norm that evacuation spaces must be safe, right? And for most places, if you've ever seen an evacuation, most evacuation spaces in a disaster are not child safe and they're not gender safe. So we don't even have those norms set up properly yet. This is the other really weird fact that I try to explain to people. Most people would not necessarily see a logical link between forced and early marriage and climate impacts. But there is a very strong link then that when there is precarity faced by families, a survival strategy for those families are the selling and giving of the girl child in marriage. And this particular statistic, according to UNICEF, I was at the World Congress of Child Rights last week in Madrid. This particular statistic is going through the roof around the world. So again, it's this idea of that's actually foreseeable. That's something that we have an evidence-based base for, and yet why isn't the international system sounding the alarm bells about that particular connection? All right, the other big area that should be flashing a lot of alarm bells, and we're in absolutely the worst political situation to deal with it that I could have ever dreamed of, is reproductive health. So we're really going to face a huge challenge to reproductive health provision under climate displacement, and you know that's the perfect storm in terms of one of the big problems that we're having in the multilateral system at the moment. Women's health is another area where there's some debate about whether we should think about gender-based violence as a health issue, but just for the sake of completeness, I just want us to really think about all the different types of exacerbations that we might have on conflict-related sexual violence. So we know we're sitting in Switzerland. We know that there is a gendered impact of climate change from extreme heat events. The European Court of Human Rights has found that against the state of Switzerland. And other states should be on notice: India, Pakistan, Spain, Australia. And we know that this is a gendered harm. We're not exactly certain why. So we know that more women die from extreme heat than men. We think it's because women are more likely to be over 80 years old. We think there's certain physiological effects, and we also think they're more likely to be maladjusted housing. But it is true that women will die in extreme heat events more than men. The difference, the only exception to that, is men who labour outdoors, so particularly agricultural workers, delivery workers, that sort of thing. So understanding why this is happening. We also know that women are having increased ovarian cancer rates that are linked to climate impacts. And that, again, the doctors are slightly befuddled. Is this because of socioeconomic inequality? Is it because of some sort of biological factor? We're not exactly sure. We know women have increased blood salinity rates, so do men. So basically, as our drinking water is salinated by rising sea levels, we're getting more saline in our blood as a humanity, and that has particular impacts on women when it comes to reproductive health. We also have newborns that are born now with microplastics, and we don't know quite how that's going to affect women and girls ongoing. But that microplastics issue seems to be a non-gendered impact, but it particularly, as I said, we're finally starting to find microplastics in newborns, so that can't be good. All right, so to finish up so we can have questions. And you'll go back to Australia, you harbinger of doom. All right, now this is the sort of thing we want to start thinking about, how to bring a systems approach to our thinking about the nexus between gender and climate change so we can prevent the worst happening, right? So not only are we preventing the worst excesses, so we've got to keep focusing on these mitigation targets, but we have to start really granular and evidence-based prevention planning in our national adaptation plans. I have not yet seen a national adaptation plan that I would say is particularly gender transformative. I don't know if you have, but I haven't. Some of them mention women and girls, but I mean, I know for Australia's national adaptation plan, we were very focused on what might happen to the mining industry, not as focused on what might happen in female-dominated industries like health, for example. So we're not quite there yet where we're doing really conscious work around just a decent gender-sensitive approach to, or gender-responsive approach to adaptation that thinks about social inequality in a meaningful way. So some of the ways we might think about prevention is at least acknowledging the things that we do now that could be scaled up, essentially. So we do have a reasonable evidence base for how to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. Actually, we have some really good evidence about that. Sexual violence in our conflict is not inevitable. It certainly is not. It can be prevented, and good systems, both with military training, but also good NGO interventions and great community information. You can stop. It is not inevitable that sexual violence takes place in armed conflict zones. Not inevitable. And we are going to one day reach a place where even if armed conflict is not able to be written out of the human experience, we can have wars that have limits, right? And I know that feels hard to believe when we're thinking about Ukraine and Gaza at the moment, but and Syria and Congo and various other conflicts, but it is possible. But it does take real attention to prevention, which is what we are lacking at the moment. So these are the types of things that we could do. And these are the sorts of things UN Women do say, and UNFCCC documents do say, but they say at a level of abstraction that is too high for most community contexts. But, they're the right direction. They're the right types of things. And currently, I can't actually name any state who's doing this particularly at the moment. But we're hopeful that it will, we can start influencing states. So my next project is to look at every state's national action plan and every state's gender equality strategy and try to see if there can be some happy merging of the two. But at the moment, it's not looking great. So Mary, she was doing some truth talking at the last COP. really talking about the very current geopolitical pressures. And I'm not as brave as Mary, so I'll let Mary say it. But we really do not have the geopolitical conditions at the moment to do the kind of brave and true sort of work that we need to do on gender prevention at the moment. So it's really important that we, in the multilateral settings, which some of you are here in Switzerland, we really do pay attention to language. And I really like this quote to end on, the idea that words in the multilateral system can become very ritualistic, but they do carry power. And I love this idea that they are the words that become the script for future girls' lives. So I would like all of us to start thinking about the way we talk about gender and climate in a really meaningful and intentional way, and a way that is hopeful. So even though I've just spent the last half hour freaking you out, I mean to inspire you with hope that we can prevent the very worst types of vulnerabilities being exacerbated by climate change. And we can. It is absolutely possible, but it will need intent, and it will need civil society really stepping up. So that's all from me. Thank you.
I open the floor for questions from here, but also let's see if someone would like to. Yeah, you can also from online raise questions just so we can check chat or whatever. So yeah.
The first question: how to understand an Australian accent?
No. Sì, Elisabetta, please go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Since I'm Elisabetta Lambiase, I'm a PhD living here in the World Trade Institute, and my PhD thesis actually concerned climate change, gender-based violence and discrimination in relation with human mobility. So it's quite connected for your speech. I would love, first of all, to thank you for the amazing speech. But what I'm struggling right now for my thesis project is to gather data, because I understood, and I of course read also the majority of the documents that actually providing for the relation of climate change and the exacerbation of gender-based violence. But of course, in order for me to write a thesis on the subject, I need the data. And I wanted to ask you whether there is some kind of tool that actually I can use in order to try to understand if there is a way to gather this data. Because one of the last reading I actually bumped into was saying that the problem with the collection of the data is the awareness of people that maybe what actually is happening, the exacerbation of sexual-based violence and so on is related to climate change. People who are facing this problem do not know that it's because of climate change. So I would like to ask, since I think that data are important, how can I do in order to put them in as the basis of my thesis, and that's it. How can we actually focus on this specific topic if data are not available yet?
It's a perfect question, and it's so difficult for my own research too, because I have to rely on quite partial data sets. So even though I am the very model of a social scientist I'm a lawyer, right? I read judgments. I like treaties. I read treaties and I have ideas. That's how I work. And yet in this area, you have to become a data scientist. It's terrible. I really struggle. So I'm part of a new organization called Gender and Environment Data Alliance, which I would really recommend that you join, because we are creating the types of data sets that we need. That's run by the main people are WEDO, the Women's Environmental data organization. They run the Gender and Climate Tracker, which currently is the UN, it tracks all UN work at the Gender and Climate Nexus. But we're basically going to have to create the data that we need, I think, and force governments to disaggregate data that is important. So this is why I often rely on health, because health is good at gender disaggregated data, but other areas, but even then, you know, extreme heat data is only very recently become gender disaggregated. And this idea about Data in conflict is very difficult to collect for obvious reasons. So you're always working on past sets. And I think one of you wonderful PhD students this morning was talking about how difficult it is to plan for things that are novel, right, outside the human experience. Most human knowledge is iterative. It's based on lessons learned from past experience. A lot of the issues we're going to deal with climate change will be a mixture of things that we've known. So we know how to deal with cyclones, but we don't know how to deal with what's coming next, which is a new category of cyclone, category 6 cyclone. So we might not, we have some knowledge, but we don't have all the knowledge we need. So Australians know how to fight bushfires, but we don't know how to fight bushfires that don't act the way they're meant to act because they're exacerbated by climate change, right? So this is the difficulty, I think, of climate adaptation is you're dealing with what you know, and then you're dealing with a layer which is entirely novel to human experience, right? Unless you're hanging out with the dinosaurs, you haven't experienced this level of climate change in this period of time. So it's really, really difficult for the human brain to get its head around, and our knowledge bases often lead us astray. So we know a lot of the data scientists are just used to using previous data sets, and if the assumptions are different, then data is wrong. So I think for data scientists it's a rough time. And that's just the weather people. I don't know how the social scientists are coping. So really, it's really important. So we've always known, for example, that crime rises on a hot day, right? So we know that, and it's always been the case. In human history, crime is worse on a hot day. Always been the case, right? It's one of those weird criminology facts they like throwing around. But what we don't really know is what happens when you have twice as many hot days a summer as you normally do. Then what happens to crime in that scenario? We don't know stuff like that, right? And we're still guessing. So the data question is such a great one, and I think it's about, that's another thing we can all do, just pressuring people, and the gender strategies need to kind of focus on this is the type of data that we're going to need to track this. Another example is sectoral adaptation. So we know that they care about the agricultural sector, they care about tourism, they might care about energy sector, they care about transport, but are they doing proper gender disaggregated data about how those sectors need to transform? I'm not sure they are.
I wanted to say that there was it's a marvelous perspective you have, but it's terrible. But on the other hand, there was a deep silence unless you said, well, there are these hot days, and hot days, crimes are committed. And the deep silence, obviously, is about mental health and the biology of behavior. And we had the pandemic as well. And we have this enormous explosion of violence, which is gender violence, which is climate violence. I mean, the program 2025 of these people is appalling, the amount of destruction. And what we are facing is terrible. I mean, the Italian government just made a law 31.1 that the Secret Service can kill without any prosecution. Okay, that's where we are. And one of the blind spots is bipolar disorder. I can say in Bern you get shot if you talk about bipolar disorder at university or anywhere. You get professors, they remove my license because I was interested in medical things about bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder is a very special one. It's 4% of youngsters, and it's very much inclined to sex matters and to violence, and we know this. And huge politicians who made great things or bad things, but they were bipolar, you know. And yes, what can we do to change matters?
Yeah, well, look, your point about mental health is a huge one, and I should have said one of the worst gendered aspects of climate change that I concern myself very deeply about, but I didn't mention today, is around the area of masculinities and climate change, which is men are far more likely to commit suicide after a natural disaster than women, far more likely, and the kind of rates of that are going up as well. I think there's pressure to protect and provide, which is comes under such strain in a disaster. So, we've got to do really urgent work on masculinities and climate change as well. It's very important to really think through how those things are manifesting and to protect people's rights. But mental health is a real issue. It's already a massive issue for most of our young people, and we know there is a level of eco-anxiety under some of these mental health issues. We also know there's social media stresses and a range of other issues. Myself, I feel like the anxiety that young people feel about the environment is extremely rational. So I guess I don't see it as a mental health issue per se, but I can see it producing very rational levels of high anxiety. Mental health is such a massive issue in relation to climate change and any type of COVID we saw as well. I would just say, I don't want to minimise, especially not in Europe, the impact of COVID, but I will say more women in Australia died from domestic violence in the first lockdowns than they did with COVID, which does give you pause, right? And again, avoidable if we thought about that intervention in a more gender responsive way than we did, and we had mechanisms to help people, which we eventually got, but so there's just so much learning we need to do about taking a gender responsive view to transitions generally, to change, deep change. And climate change is going to be the deepest change to most of our lives that we'll ever face, COVID notwithstanding. And pandemics themselves are also affecting our climate. They're going to become more frequent. And the WHO pandemic treaty was concluded by consensus by leaving out the gender language. So if you read the pandemic treaty, it's got one sad little reference to gender equality in the preamble, and all the rest was taken out because it's a consensus negotiation, and the geopolitical issues we have at the moment meant that the only way they could get that pandemic treaty agreed was to take the gender language out. So this is what we're up to, right? Like, instead of preparing us for the next phase, we're actually doing the opposite that we should be doing. But I like your reference to Project 2025. If we can't make the connection between gender and climate, I tell you, the far right do. They see it all as a piece, right? That progressive ideas about sexual identity and gender roles and the willingness to prevent climate change impacts are very related in an ideological way for the far right. So I feel like, and if you read the manifestos, they're all right there and well funded, right? So where's the thinking and the manifestos and the funding coming from the other direction to really think about progressive gender ideology and climate prevention and the same climate impact prevention and the same piece? So yeah, it's bleak.
Well, Australia is kind of a sanctuary of modern psychiatry these days. I mean, American psychiatry is under massive attack. And here also in Switzerland, I mean, it's just certain views. But in Australia, you have so many centers of people who are really at the forefront of these problems.
Yeah, it's good to know. Well, I work with many psychiatrists who are interested in mental health and human rights, and human rights and mental health and psychiatry have a dark past, so they're interested in this, trying to use the profession to promote human rights. So it's really important. Sorry,
yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for your very inspiring, insightful presentation. I have a small background in gender studies, and you talk about this nexus between gender and climate, and with the focus on women and girls, which I think is really important. But I was wondering, what is your take on the vulnerability created by climate change for other genders than male-female dichotomy? I mean, there's a bigger range there.
Yes.
Is there any data on that, or what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there must be, right? Because we know that people of different gender identities and sexual identities are already facing huge amounts of discrimination. So by the same logic that I would apply to an amplifier of current discrimination, then we would think that is right. We have some data on LGBTIQ+, people in their adaptation strategies for climate change. So again, it's things like safe evacuation centres in a disaster for the queer community just don't exist at the moment, and that we can do that. We can make evacuation processes and disaster processes safe for people. We can think about privacy in the way that we respond to climate disasters or climate impacted disasters in a way that preserves people's right to privacy. But we don't have a lot of other really decent information, and it's part of this Gender and Data Alliance. It's called the Gender and Data Alliance because it is going to focus on all sorts of gender identities and sexual preferences as well. And it's this piece about what does it mean to be truly human in the Anthropocene, right? This is the question of, is there an opportunity to build a world that is less capitalist, less repressive, less, it might be, right? It could be a sloughing off of old extreme capitalist ways and a more sustainable economy, a better relationship with the environment, a better relationship with each other that respects difference properly. Like it could be that. That's the kind of the Mazzucato idea and Stiglitz's idea that the new economy could be much better for people, less exploitative, less about domination, more about sharing of power. So I hope so, but I can't say I've seen any decent data sets, particularly about non-binary people. There is some about disasters, and there's some about health and reproductive health, for example. And I'm just all I know about what happens to displaced people after disasters is that the most vulnerable people in that cohort are, facing really difficult periods. So everything I've read, and I'd like to hear my colleagues' views, but everything I've read is that we should expect and plan for real problems and be alive to the kind of differentiated experience people are going to have. There's really not a lot. There's a bit about Hurricane Katrina. There's some about the Indian Ocean tsunami. And there's really nothing much because these people's lives, minority lives, are just not valued in the way they should be. Minority experiences. And to me, those, like people with disabilities, right? That lens always tells us much more about human adaptation, human ingenuity, human capability. And yet that 10% of our population is often not listened to properly and not planned for emergencies or climate adaptation. And they are probably the part of the population that are most adaptable, most ingenious. So it's frustrating. Yeah.
I think we are close to the end. I'm really sorry because if there are not questions from the audience online, I really need to close the lecture now. But maybe you can continue after the end. So I would like to thank all our participants online and also here, everybody who joined. So thank you a lot, and Professor Harris. So I think we can close. Thank you a lot.